If you told me last spring that a single HOA officer with a chainsaw could turn my quiet ranch into the center of a countywide feud, I would have laughed and offered you a glass of sweet tea. But that was before Karen showed up, before the fence came down, and before I realized just how far some people will go when they think a yellow badge gives them the right to trample over 100 years of family history. My ranch sits on the edge of what used to be open prairie, a patchwork of rolling pastures, weathered barns, and dirt roads that wind to the fields like veins. My great-granddad built the first fence here with his own hands, and every generation since has added a little more, another barn, a new gate, a few more acres. The land's always been private, and the roads that cross it are mine, maintained at my expense, used by my family, my workers, and the occasional neighbor who asks permission. That all changed when the Willow Creek HOA expanded their subdivision right up to my southern boundary. At first, it was just a few new houses and some curious looks from city folks who weren't used to the smell of horses or the sound of a rooster at dawn. I tried to be neighborly, waving when I passed their SUVs on the county road, even letting a few kids fish in my pond. But then the complaints started about the dust, the cows, the unsightly tractors parked by the barn. I shrugged it off, figuring they'd get used to country life or move back to the city. I never expected them to try and take what wasn't theirs. It started with a letter from the HOA, delivered by a woman with a clipboard and a forced smile. "We'd like to discuss access," she said, as if my land was a public park. "Some of our residents would appreciate a shortcut through your property to reach the main road." I told her politely but firmly that my roads were private, not a thoroughfare, and that was the end of it, or so I thought. A week later, I came home from a feed store to find my south fence in splinters, a fresh set of tire tracks cutting across my pasture, and Karen, her name stitched in bold on her HOA uniform, standing in the gap with a chainsaw in hand and a look of pure entitlement on her face. "You can't block community access," she snapped before I could even ask what she was doing. The Bard voted. This is now an easement for Willow Creek residents. I stared at her, stunned, as she waved a stack of papers in my face. None of them legal, all of them stamped with the HOA logo. "You're trespassing," I said, voice low and tight, "and you just destroyed private property." She rolled her eyes, as if I was the unreasonable one. "You will be hearing from our lawyer," she said, then marched back to her SUV, leaving the fence in ruins and my blood boiling. I spent the next hour repairing what I could, cursing under my breath and snapping photos of the damage. I called the sheriff, who came out, took one look at the mess, and shook his head. "They can't do this," he said. But he also warned me that HOAs have a way of making trouble for folks who stand up to them. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by deeds, maps, and old family photos, and made a decision. If the HOA want to fight, they get one, but it would be on my terms. I drafted a letter banning all Willow Creek HOA officers and residents from using my roads, citing state trespass laws, and the clear boundaries marked on every survey since 1912. I posted copies at every gate, mailed one to the HOA board, and handed another to the sheriff for good measure. The next morning, I watched from the porch as Karen and her crew pulled up, read the sign, and fumed. She tried to argue, but I just pointed to the no trespassing notice and told her to call her lawyer if she had a problem. The look on her face was worth every splinter I'd pulled from my hands the night before. But I knew this was just the beginning. The fallout from Karen's chainsaw stunt was immediate and loud, echoing through the county like a bad rumor at a church picnic. By noon the next day, my phone was blowing up with calls from neighbors, ranch hands, and even a few Willow Creek residents who were just as shocked as I was. Some apologized for the HOA's behavior. Others wanted to know if the rumors were true, and a few, mostly the new folks, demanded to know why their shortcut to the main road was suddenly blocked. I explained, calmly at first, that my roads were private, maintained at my expense, and that the fence had been cut down without permission. Most understood, but a handful, emboldened by Karen's bravado, insisted that the HOA had rights to access my land. I told her to take it up with the sheriff or a judge, but until then, the answer was no. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She sent me a certified letter, this time on official HOA letterhead, demanding that I restore access and threatening to fine me for obstructing community transit. She even included a copy of the so-called easement vote, which, upon closer inspection, was nothing more than a list of signatures from a handful of board members. No legal description, no county approval, nothing binding. I took the letter straight to my lawyer, a grizzled old cowboy named Hank, who'd been wrangling property disputes since before I was born. He read it, snorted, and said, "They don't have a leg to stand on. You want to hit back?" I nodded, and together we drafted a cease and desist order, citing every relevant state and county law, and making it clear that any further trespass or property damage would result in criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. We sent copies to the HOA, the county clerk, and the sheriff's office, and I posted another round of no trespassing signs, this time with a warning that violators would be prosecuted. The next few days were tense. Karen and her crew drove by every morning, glaring from their SUVs, but they didn't set foot on my land. Instead, they started a smear campaign, posting on social media about how I was selfishly blocking community access and hurting property values. Some of the comments got nasty, but for every critic, there were 2 or 3 neighbors who spoke up in my defense, sharing photos of the broken fence and reminding everyone that private property means just that, private. The local paper picked up the story, and soon reporters were calling, wanted to know why a rancher was at war with the HOA. I told them the truth. I wasn't against neighbors, but I wouldn't stand for trespass or vandalism, no matter how many votes the HOA took. The sheriff, for his part, made it clear that the law was on my side. He increased patrols, warned the HOA to back off, and even called a meeting with the board to explain, in no uncertain terms, that cutting down fences was a crime. Karen, undeterred, tried to escalate. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming I was impeding emergency access and endangering public safety. The county inspector came out, looked at my roads, and laughed. "These are private, and you're well within your rights," he said, shaking my hand. "If they want access, they'll have to buy it or get a court order." That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the barn, and felt a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. I hated the drama, but I was proud of how I'd stood my ground. The next morning, I woke to find a fresh set of tire tracks in mud. Someone had tried to sneak to the back pasture, but got stuck and had to walk out. I called the sheriff, who found the SUV abandoned and towed it at the owner's expense. Word spread fast, and by the end of the week, nobody from Willow Creek dared set foot on my land. But Karen wasn't done yet, and I knew the real fight was just getting started. The next phase of the battle was pure HOA theater, with Karen and her board pulling every trick in the book to try and force my hand. First came a barrage of official-looking letters, each one thicker and more threatening than the last, accusing me of everything from creating a public nuisance to willful obstruction of community development. They claimed my refusal to allow access was negatively impacting quality of life for Willow Creek residents, and even tried to argue that my cattle were a health hazard because they sometimes grazed near the property line. I kept every letter, scanned them, and sent copies to Hank, who responded with a steady stream of legal rebuttals, each one more pointed than the last. The HOA's lawyer, clearly out of their depth, tried to arrange a mediation session, but Hank shut that down fast, reminding them that trespass and vandalism weren't up for negotiation. Meanwhile, Karen started showing up at county meetings, waving photos of the broken fence and demanding commissioners do something about my uncooperative attitude. The commissioners, most of whom had grown up in the area and knew my family, politely listened and then reminded her that private property rights were protected by state law. Frustrated, Karen tried to rally the Willow Creek residents, organizing a petition and holding a community march that fizzled when only a handful of people showed up, most of them more interested in the free donuts than the cause. The local news ran a follow-up story, this time focusing on the HOA's overreach and the growing backlash from other landowners. I started getting calls from folks in neighboring counties, some of whom had faced similar battles and wanted advice on how to stand up to their own HOAs. The support was overwhelming, and it gave me the energy to keep pushing back. I hosted a barbecue for my neighbors, inviting everyone who'd stood by me, and we spent the evening swapping stories, laughing, and making plans to form a landowners association to protect our rights. The sheriff stopped by, tipped his hat, and told me the county prosecutor was looking into possible charges against Karen for property damage. That news spread like wildfire, and suddenly the tone from the HOA changed. Their next letter was almost apologetic, suggesting a mutually beneficial agreement, and offering to pay for fence repairs if I would consider limited access for emergency vehicles. I took the offer to Hank, who just grinned and said, "They're scared. Don't give them an inch." I agreed. I wrote back, thanking them for the offer, but making it clear that my roads would remain private, and that any future request for access would have to go through the proper legal channels. I also demanded full reimbursement for the fence repairs and an official apology for the trespass and vandalism. The board dragged their feet, but with the county and the press watching, they eventually caved, sending a check for the repairs and a letter, signed by Karen herself, admitting that the fence should never have been cut and promising that no further attempts would be made to access my land without permission. I posted the letter on my barn door, right next to the no trespassing sign, and shared a photo online. The response was instant. Neighbors cheered, and even a few Willow Creek residents sent messages of support. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe easy. But I also knew that vigilance was the price of freedom, and with the apology letter tacked to my barn and the check for repairs cashed, life on the ranch finally started to settle back into its old, familiar rhythm. The grass grew tall again along the repaired fence line, and the only tracks on my roads were from my own boots, the ranch truck, and the occasional neighbor who always called ahead. The Willow Creek HOA, chastened and quieter, kept their distance, and Karen herself was rarely seen outside the subdivision, her chainsaw days apparently behind her. The county prosecutor's investigation into the fence-cutting incident made the local news, and while no charges were ultimately filed, the message was clear. Private property rights mattered, and even the most determined HOA couldn't bulldoze their way through a century of family history. The landowners association we'd started at that barbecue grew quickly, with ranchers and farmers from all over the county joining forces to share resources, legal advice, and a sense of solidarity that had been missing for years. We held regular meetings in my barn, swapping stories and making sure everyone knew their rights and how to defend them. The sheriff and county officials even attended a few times, offering their support and promising to keep an eye on any future HOA shenanigans. The best part was seeing the community come together. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before now worked side by side, mending fences, sharing equipment, and looking out for each other. The ranch itself thrived. With the threat of trespass gone, I expanded the herd, planted a new orchard, and even hosted a fall festival that brought families from both sides of the fence together for food, music, and laughter. The old wounds started to heal, and even a few Willow Creek residents came by to apologize for the trouble, admitting they'd been misled by the board's scare tactics. I welcomed them, because that's what neighbors do, but I made it clear that the roads and fences would stay private, and that respect for boundaries was non-negotiable. As the seasons changed and the fields turned gold under the autumn sun, I realized that the real victory wasn't just about keeping my land or banning the HOA from my roads. It was about reclaiming a sense of community, pride, and independence that no board or badge could ever take away. I learned that standing your ground isn't always easy, and sometimes it means weathering storms you never saw coming. But it's worth it every time you look out over your land and know it's truly yours. And if Karen or anyone else ever gets the idea to bring a chainsaw to my fence again, they'll find a whole county standing with me, ready to defend what's right. In the end, I didn't just ban the HOA from my roads. I reminded everyone on both sides of the fence that respect, neighborliness, and a little stubbornness go a long way in keeping the peace and protecting what matters most.